There has been a long-standing debate about whether pilot training flight simulator is better than Project Flight and Roblox. Today we'll explore each of these games by giving them points for each of these categories, but let's get into it. So into our first category, you can tell that the PTFS UI has not been updated in a while, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. A lot of people, including myself, like the retro graphical Roblox look, but it's also completely valid to say that it looks quite outdated. Project Flight's GUI, on the other hand, has a much more modern look, with sound effects as well. Something I noticed in PTFS is you have to walk to a gate to spawn a plane in, but in Project Flight you select a gate and airport all at once. You spawn in the plane, not the airport. However, this is subject to opinion, but I'm going to give this point to Project Flight anyway. Our next category, environment customization. PTFS does not have the ability to customize the environment, whereas in Project Flight you can control the time of day, the place in the sky where the sun is. It's called like geographic latitude or something like that. Haze, glare and density, and some other options, which you can check out. You can really have some fun with it. This one is easily going to Project Flight, it's a no-brainer. Our next category is terrain. PTFS has a much simpler Roblox style of terrain, which some people may prefer, and it matches with the simplicity of the game. Others, however, can view it as blocky and too unrealistic. Project Flight uses actual images of terrain and meshes to create an effect that makes the terrain look like real life. However, up close on some of the older airports, like the UK island, Catilla, and Menorca, if you look up too close, then they can get quite blurry. In my opinion, Project Flight has more realistic terrain models, so I'm going to give Project Flight the point again. Now moving on to airports. PTFS airports are kind of okay, I guess. They have kind of interiors, they're functional for the use of getting to spawn in a plane, but not for a realistic passenger effect. Project Flight has much more highly detailed airports, however they don't have interiors. Instead, they have parallax interiors, which is like an optical illusion of an interior. It creates an incredibly convincing effect. Project Flight will take the point for this one, as they're just more realistic and detailed. However, PTFS has interiors, Project Flight does not. If you're enjoying this video so far, please consider subscribing, as it would really help out the channel. Thank you. Now on the camera. In PTFS, there is no camera selection, and the camera is centered around the player in the cockpit, which is a bit painful to use at times. In Project Flight, there are 8 camera presets, which include external view, and the camera is centered around the center of the plane, similar to how it is in Microsoft Flight Simulator. Project Flight has a smoother, easier experience and takes the point once more. Now on to the one that probably matters most to you guys, airplane modeling. Now this one should be pretty obvious which one's going to win, but let's compare them both anyway. PTFS has mediocre models, however some of the newer PTFS models do look miles better than the older ones, yet they still look quite kind of blocky and unreflective at most times. Project Flight has much smoother meshes and have much more intricate details, for example the A350 landing gear. As expected, Project Flight takes this win. Animations are a fun one. PTFS has no animations. Instead, the flaps and landing gear just kind of teleport, which, believe it or not, isn't true to life. Project Flight has animations for landing gear, flaps, spoilers, and reverse thrust, and they are very realistic animations. Now we move on to Pushback and Startup. PTFS uses reverse thrust to pushback, and keeping the speed and heading in correct is quite challenging. In Project Flight you just press P and it pushes you back, with much easier ground handling. Neither games have pushback tugs animated unfortunately, but I'd say Project Flight overall has a better startup experience. Also in Project Flight, the engines start up one at a time, whereas in PTFS they just both start up all at once. Onto taxiing. PTFS, as mentioned, has difficult ground handling, and the throttle generally is weird to use, and as I said earlier, keeping the plane straight is so much more difficult because it's just so sensitive. Project Flight, there is a strange bug where even with a maintained heading, the plane sometimes drifts off its course, but it's only really noticeable when you're going at slow speeds, like when you're going at 4 or 5 knots. But despite the throttle, it is nice to use and the handling is much smoother. Project Flight again has a smoother experience, so it gets the point. Probably one of the most important categories is flight physics. I don't know how to explain it, but PTFS is a lot harder to fly in as instead of the cursor being used as a flight control thing, it feels like the plane's nose is actively trying to get as close towards the cursor as possible. But it's likely this is just because of the camera view where you're centered around the front. Project Flight has a smooth physics system, which is actually getting a complete overhaul soon update 9. Again, Project Flight has a smooth experience probably because it has a more advanced physics model, and the camera is centered around the center of the plane, which makes it a lot easier to use. Personally, I think Project Flight has a better physics system, so they get the point again. Now we have Cockpits. This is a much more difficult category to work with as PTFS has more cockpits, but they are much less detailed and not interactive to any extent. However, Project Flight only has 2 cockpits, in the Boeing 737 and the Eurofighter Typhoon, and they are somewhat interactive, and Project Flight even has working PFD, Primary Flight Display. For this category, I'll give both games a point as they both have positives and negatives. Cabins are quite the opposite. Project Flight does not have cabins, so they're probably not getting the point, and I don't think it ever will because it will just be too laggy for people that are mobile players. So for the first time in today's video, PTFS takes the win individually. And now for some miscellaneous comments to add. Project Flight has a wider variety of emergencies to choose from, which gives it an extra point, but PTFS has the ability to land on water, which are both good things from a roleplay point of view. Anyway, that's all from me today. If you enjoyed, please consider subscribing as it would be greatly appreciated. We are trying to get to 400 subscribers by the end of April. Can we do it? Goodbye.